Wow, look at this. This was the shot that made me want to talk about this scene at all. So if these elements are only on screen for one frame, then why bother doing them at all? The Vulture design overall is just amazing, and definitely one of the parts of the movie that goes by really quickly, but is worth taking a deeper look into. All right, let's get into it.
Good to know!
Okay, so off the bat, we have some really cool establishing shots. So Gwen is moving on 2s and the background is moving on 1s. The reason being that you don't want the characters to feel like they are stuttering at all. Because of this really hyper exaggerated animation style, it really helps when you have at least one element moving smoothly, in this case, the background. So if you notice, if we step through here, you can see that Gwen's pose actually holds every 2 frames. So 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. So the background is actually changing every frame, just so we get that really smooth sense with the camera panning. And obviously we have some color changes on here, on her back. These colors are actually the police sirens. So in color theory, because Gwen's world is basically pink and a bunch of watercolor hues, the red and the blue actually gets tinted to a pink and a cyan that we have here. So thought that was really cool. So as far as the effects elements go in this scene, there's some really interesting things going on here. Like you have the foreground elements of this smoke shape that you can see kind of coming through on the side here. So you can see it right here in the foreground, but because of the backlighting against it, it actually appears silhouetted against this shape here, which I think is really interesting. But let's look at these poses because there's some really cool stuff going on. So obviously Gwen is trained as a ballerina and that is showcased in her animation styles. So the poses that she's hitting is really emphasizing the shape of the body. So right here you have her doing a straight up and down handstand while she flips into this move. Every chance they get, they will do these pointed toes on Gwen. In the next shot, when we go to that one and she lands, you can see they straight up have the toe pointed right here. And there's a really cool shape and balance of this pose where everything is, you know, going up towards this way. You have the foot, I mean, the toe is pointed here as well. The line work goes up the leg, leading your eye to this joint here. And even the arms are perpendicular to this. So interesting poses are really cool, but how do you get out of this pose? Let's see what the animators do here. So what they could do is have Gwen just stand straight up. But what actually is happening here is her weight needs to shift from one foot to the other. So even though her weight, you know, the center of gravity is here right now, if her foot is going to come down here this way, then we have to have the weight, which is usually around the hips. We need that to shift towards that other foot before we stand up and use it. So this is kind of an anticipation as well as a weight change. So they're actually moving the center of gravity this way. So you have it come over here. So I'm actually going to turn on the ghosting here so we can see that. So her weight is here, and then we move it to be over here. So now you can see the weight has shifted over this way, and now we're back up this way when she stands up. So as you can see from this onion skinning here, the center of gravity is actually moving over to the right first and then up to the left. So instead of going from, and you can kind of see it here, this initial pose here to this one, we're actually going to the right and up. And now we have this pose where she's straight up and down. So let's take a look at these stylized shapes going across the screen here. So we have this wipe across camera that Vulture is cutting in front of the camera like this, but the shapes on his outline are really interesting. So let's take a look here. So it seems like they're using some of these solid color edges to act as sort of a bleeding edge, as if it was out of focus. So you have this really harsh shape here of the black, but then you have this green shape that's kind of in here that kind of comes across at the end here too. I'm going to turn off the ghosting, but you can see these green edges are kind of acting as sort of a blur between the black and the blue. So they want to keep it as stylized as this giant black shape. And as you'll see later, what the character looks like definitely has more of this outline here. So they're trying to blur this together. So they have this green edge kind of act as a sort of a bridge between those two colors. But you know, you have these really jagged, super interesting, and I'm going to change colors here. You have these super interesting dynamic shapes just coming across, and it's only on screen for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 frames. These animation reaction videos are a lot of fun for me because I really enjoy learning new things. Especially in any creative field, staying up to date on the latest tools and skill sets is important for personal growth and setting yourself up for success in the future. That's why I'm thrilled to share with you that this video is sponsored by Skillshare. Skillshare is the largest online community for creatives, offering thousands of high-quality classes taught by industry leaders and professionals. For instance, you can take classes like the YouTube Success class with MKBHD, design your own virtual persona with Teflon Sega, and many more. I've been using Skillshare to take Alvin Wan's Python for Beginners class, and I've gone from having zero Python experience to being able to create nifty tools like a password generator. Learning Python is helping me get better at using Blender, my 3D software of choice, which uses Python extensively under the hood for things like scripts and UIs. Having a better understanding of this programming language has been a lot of fun and really rewarding. With school breaks and slower work schedules, summer is a great time to explore your passions and hobbies, especially considering how tumultuous the animation industry can be, as I've talked about before on this channel. It's extremely important to be constantly evolving yourself and pushing yourself forward if you want to have a sustainable career in this field. I plan to make the most out of my summer by delving deep into Python and machine learning to explore new sides of my creativity with the help of Skillshare. Not only that, but the first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. I strongly recommend browsing through their extensive list of classes because they really do have something for everyone. So check the link in the description and get started today. Now let's get back to learning about what those animators were doing in Spider-Verse.
Screaming their name usually works. I guess that worked.
So this next shot is our first shot of seeing Vulture in this environment. And now speaking of color theory, the way that they're making this character pop out from the background is that the background is a lot of purples and blues, but the character himself has a lot of yellows and oranges because he's supposed to be out of the Renaissance era. So in order to sell the impact of Vulture flying into Gwen, what they're doing here is actually removing some of these in-betweens. As you can see, Gwen's head moves from this part right over to here right away. So you might have had a few frames in between here where the character's head went from here to here to here to here. What they're actually doing here is having the characters move really quickly across screen, so you feel this impact a lot more. So if we just track the heads of both characters in this shot, you can see that Vulture's head starts really far on the left side of frame, but then right before it impacts Gwen, it jumps across almost, 3 times its size to hit next to the side of Gwen's head right here. So we're going from all the way over here to boom, right across here and catching her by surprise. So in this shot, you have Gwen breaking through this case of basketballs moving across, and she's hitting these really nice poses on the arcs of her falling. And they're trying to emphasize how much Gwen is bouncing by the amount that they're holding her body in the air. So in real physics, a human bouncing on the ground probably wouldn't react like this, but because she's going into a case full of basketballs, they kind of have her moving like a basketball. What I've done here is I've traced over the hips with just a green circle, so you can see exactly how her hips are bouncing off the ground. So let's watch this traced over. It feels interesting, right? So if you were going to emphasize with a bouncing ball exercise the amount of hang time that the ball is in the air for, you would have the frames of the ball in the air hold for longer before it bounces back on the ground. And that's exactly what they're doing here. So check this out. The amount of frames that the ball is actually hitting the ground for is less than the amount of frames that it's in the air for. Okay, so let's finally take a look at Vulture.
I am the Vulture, the pinnacle of man's genius.
You're not my Vulture.
I think this might be one of the most underrated character designs in all of Spider-Verse. So just like the source material of Da Vinci's sketches, there's a lot of detail here, and there's a lot worth looking at really closely. So when this shot came on screen in the theaters, this really blew me away because I really have no idea what specifically is going on here. So here's what I think is happening. I think they have a 3D base design that they're using for this character and then drawing over the character with line work. So you have some really consistent shapes, like in the wings here, you have this arm kind of function. This shape has a lot of consistent volume. So I think a lot of this is 3D, but a lot of this line work in the back here, now they're either doing some trickery with some shaders that I don't really have a full understanding of, but I think what they're doing is drawing in some of these feathers in the line work back here by hand. It feels like this character is supposed to be cut out of his world almost with like scissors. So they have this really hard edge along the character here that bleeds in and keeps his line work and overall colors and aesthetic inside a contained shape. So with a character design that's this chaotic, there's a few things that the designers have to keep in mind when they're trying to create a character like this, where you're trying to control some of this chaotic character design. So here's some important things that they are doing so that your eye doesn't get completely lost. It looks like they have a mask right here, actually, of the lighting. So the rest of this over here is pretty much in darkness the whole time, but you have this spotlight effect that's on the center of the character. So it actually helps your eye land on something, because if it was off and there was no lighting effect, this would just be one chaotic chaotic treatment of line works and colors and shapes, and your eye would get really lost. So they have to give you something in this chaos to center your eyes on, and that would be his head. So what's really cool about this is they're keeping the consistency of that hard edge on the shadows as well. So Vulture's shadow is really, really harsh. It has this really harsh line work. And, typically if a light source was really far away, it would probably have a softer edge. But right now they're really going for that graphic flair on this character. So they really want him to stick out from the rest of this. So they have this really hard shadow edge on here. Isn't this cool? Isn't this so cool?
What are you, made of parchment?
What cursed world have you brought me to?
You're glitching, huh? In there.
Where are you from, bud?
Now here's the shot where he starts glitching. So I'm just going to step through this glitch effect and see what's actually going on here. So it feels like they're going for an overall digital damaged effect for this glitch effect. And what I mean by that is some of the elements are holding for 2 or 3 frames, while there's these other little particles that kind of flip in and out. So if you step back and forth between 2 frames, you can see these particles kind of coming in and out, but the overall shape of it is staying consistent. And then they're toggling that on, it seems like, only for a handful of frames. So I think a really interesting detail about the way that they move Gwen is almost always her feet are together on the ground when she's standing, which is very much a ballerina type pose. I'm gonna look up what that ballerina pose is. First position, okay. Well, now we know. So almost every chance they get, they have her feet really close together. I'm actually creating a character right now that moves like a ballerina. So this is a really interesting exercise for me to see. If you want more details on that character, as well as the other project that I'm working on called New Venice, you can check out the videos on my channel.
I am an artist, an engineer.
Oh, great.
A Renaissance man.
So going back to earlier with what I said about the head being the brightest thing on the body, you can kind of really see that here. So the head here is completely a different shade of brightness than the rest of this background colors on the character. So you have this really brighter spotlight on the character around his head, because that's where we should be looking. We should be looking around the character's eyes. So then they start to emphasize different things by turning off and on the brightness of different elements. So when the emphasis switches to the weapon in the foreground, you can see that now the brightest part of this whole thing is his weapon right here. So they want your eye to focus on this part of his body before it fires off some projectiles. And now that the Vulture is in the background and these projectiles are in the foreground, you can see that they are now the brightest thing compared to the background of Vulture, which is a little more muted. So I think it's a really interesting way of showcasing how to differentiate between elements that are supposed to be graphic like this. So when Gwen reacts to this element coming in, you can see that her spider senses are right on, and they're jumping this pose really quickly to this other pose where she's turned back so that she's dodging it. But you can see the element right here as if it's going to strike her shoulder, and then she just moves out of the way in one pose. It's a really cool, subtle way of showing that she's on top of her game here. So I want to talk about the way that the spider people in these movies use their web slingers. Almost every time that they are using their web shooters, the web starts out in this really long flowing shape that has a lot of slack on it. So it's almost as if the point right here is coming out and it's just trying to hit anything that it can. And as it goes further and further out from the character, you can see that the amount of slack reduces significantly. So it goes from this frequency to now the frequency is a little more muted, but because it's taking up a longer space. You can tell when the web actually connects with something because it will usually go straight. So from here, if we step through this, you can see it's got a lot of slack here. And then at this moment here, you can see that she kind of gives it a tug back because her arm grips onto it. So they have this little line up here to signify that it's being pulled taut, and then she uses that to fling herself up. And then from here, you can see that the web is really straight. But almost every shot in Spider-Verse, you can see it has the same sort of physics with the way that the web shoots out from their arm.
Ooh, let me guess. You were having an espresso in some old-timey Leonardo da Vinci dimension.
So with this shot of Gwen coming through and kicking Vulture, back to what we were talking about earlier, they're using every chance they can to point her toes. As you can see, the feet right here are really pointed out, keeping the line work from the leg extended out. What's really interesting about this thwack sound effect is they're using the colors of Gwen's foot to determine what the color of the sound effect will be, which I think is just a really cool detail. And they made the background really pink so that the teal and the turquoise character of the foot actually stands out. Okay, so watch what they're doing here. This is really interesting. I want to talk about duplicate limbs for a second and how Spider-Verse handles some duplicate limbs in these frames. So they're actually only holding these additional elements for one frame at a time. The hand is up here at this frame, and then we have a duplicate limb here as well as the real hand here. And then the very next frame, we're only left with this one hand. So it's only on screen for one frame. So if these elements are only on screen for one frame, then why bother doing them at all? A lot of times when animators are putting these additional elements in, it's not going to be something that the audience necessarily sees, but they will feel it. Sometimes what the animators want to do with these additional elements is emphasize certain components of their pose. So in this case, the animator wanted to emphasize the hand stopping in midair before she regains control. So they have this duplicate hand up here coming through. And so our eye lands on this hand a little better than it would if we didn't have that additional hand in there. Because then the hand would jump from all the way over here to here with nothing in between, allowing your eye to really follow that movement through. So as long as they stick something in between, even just a sense of motion blur, it gives our eye something to land on at the end. Okay, so now we're jumping really back in time here.
And suddenly a portal opens up and you wind up here.
So what's really interesting about this shot here is I believe these characters in the background are actually hand-drawn, and the character in the foreground of Vulture is still 3D. From a production standpoint, it doesn't really make sense to model and rig these additional characters. Because of the nature of this environment being completely hand-drawn, it does make sense to add in some hand-drawn characters. So now we have some quick shots of Vulture going through the multiverse and shooting out into this other world. So I actually just noticed this. Check this out. In the other shots, we have this outline on Vulture where he's definitely cut out from his world. But in this shot here, it doesn't seem like there's this hard edge cutout like we have on all the other shots. I'm not sure if they ran out of time here to add this outline or they figured it just looks good as is because our focus is supposed to be on these background actors or mannequins, I guess.
Yes, that's pretty much it.
Did you know that Spider-Verse actually does use AI? In the first movie, what they did for the line work on the characters is they didn't want to have an artist draw every single frame of the line work. So instead, what they did was drew a few frames and then had an AI run an interpolation on those frames so you get the line work on the characters. This could be a use case where you do have this AI algorithm running the same sort of effect on Vulture here, because you have these lines that are always consistently on his head, outlining each individual part of his body. So there's something really cool going on in this shot where they have the characters go from off screen over here, shoot into the right, and then they bounce into this object that's being held on chains here. And when Vulture hits, he starts to glitch, and they actually have this element, this swinging element, start to glitch as well, as if the glitch kind of went off onto this object. And then they use that to kind of wipe into this other shot. So I don't know if these were actually two shots stitched together or if this is all one continuous shot, but they do have this element sort of act as a framing device that shoots off this way to reveal Gwen's head there. It does seem like this is actually two different shots, but the way that it's edited together, it does feel like it is actually one shot. Just little stuff like this is so cool to look at.
Sidebar, maybe you could stop making a massive art museum for no reason?
So with Gwen's action here, she wants to flip Vulture over the leg by grabbing his wing and flipping him over. So they want to get across that the wing is really heavy and it takes a lot of effort for her to carry this wing over. So how are they doing this from an animation point of view? So in this frame here, they have Gwen grabbing onto the web slinging right here, which is attached off screen onto his wing. So what they have to do is lead the top half of the body and then have the arms follow through so that it does feel like there is some weight to the wing that she's pulling up. So as you notice, in these next few frames, her head and her shoulders will start to move before her arms do, to get the sense that she's using her body and the weight of her body to pull up the wing here. So you can see on this next frame, they have the body standing more straight up like this. So it's hunched over like that and then stands up straight, but her arms are still over here. They haven't been pulled over this way just yet. So they're still over on this side. And then you start to move once the body is actually moved over. Now you can start to use the weight and the strength of her arms to pull the wing up. And that's where you see a majority of the web come through at the end here. And they're actually using this as a wipe element into the next shot. So I'm gonna actually draw her hands where they are as these like circles. So now you can see, based on my rough drawovers here, that the hands start all the way over here, and after the body has moved up, do the hands come across this way. So they're moving from all the way over here back to here. So even on these really simple shots like this, you can kind of really see how the animators are working in some body dynamics. I really hate to step through these shots so quickly because there's a lot of elements going on here that are so exciting from an effects animation standpoint that I really want to give them justice, but my goodness, there's a lot to look at.
Art museum for no reason?
You call this art?
We're talking about it, aren't we?
So based on what we talked about earlier, here's another look at those webs shooting out of Gwen. So you have the initial start of the web come out here, and you can see the line has some slack on it, like here. And now you have the web connecting up here, but there's so much slack coming off of this web. And then you can see over the next few frames, it's pulled taut. So now the frequency is starting to reduce. It's a really interesting way that they're handling the physics of these web shooters, where they're kind of shooting out faster than they can really get a grip on them. I just think that's a really cool detail. But let's look at some of this effect smoke coming off of Vulture. You have these really interesting, cool shapes. I wish I was an effects animator to really describe these in further detail. But man, that looks cool. Speaking of effects elements, we have the wing dragging on the wall here, and you get these really cool electric shapes that, you know, they match the jaggedness and the edge design of his silhouette. And I'm sure it would be different if Gwen was the one actually rubbing up against the wall. They would use the physics of her world to kind of describe that effect. Okay, now we've started to move into this sort of anime streaking background effect here. So let's step through this and see what they're doing. So they want the characters to actually come down and then swoop out towards camera. They're not having the background just be straight lines going across. They're actually just having it curve. So the lines start to go this way, and as it comes through, now the lines are almost horizontal here and they flip up. That's because the characters are trying to swoop towards camera, so that you want to have the background feel like it's doing the same thing. And you have this really cool 2D sheen effects on the blade here. And that's just a solid color going across. There's nothing really too fancy with that. It's just, you know, you can probably mask this part out and then leave the blade underneath on a layer. And then you can just add this shine effect right on top as it goes across. And then this awesome 2D sparkle element as well. And that's 3 drawings, and you get that effect on there.
Oh, that's cool.
So let's step through this really interesting swoop here. So you have these really interesting star shapes coming off the background where Vulture swoops in and decapitates this Jeff Koons sculpture, which is also just a hilarious inside joke for anybody in the art world. So you have these foreground characters running out of the way because they don't want to be hit by Vulture. But then you come through here, and then on the graphic card they have here, what I believe the artist called a color burst, is if you step through here, they actually just turn off that foreground character with their legs right here. But also they're just turning off everybody in the scene here. You know, you want to be able to see Vulture crash through and really emphasize that going out. So you have a great joke here of the Jeff Koons sculpture having little mini sculptures inside, which is funny.
I mean, it's more of a meta commentary on what we call art.
So something cool about this is Gwen is actually steering Vulture by pulling him up so that he's missing the characters in the next shot. So you can see her start to pull up on him right here by using her elbows and having the shoulders pop up. They probably have the hands just ik'd down here on the body, and then the shoulders come up so that when the chest moves up, it just straightens out and it pulls the shoulders up, but keeps the hand in place so that it feels like it's just pulling against the body. And you can see her pose is maintained here, and you do get that swoop up where the character goes up and over these other security guard characters. Okay, there's a few more interesting things I want to touch on here, so let's take a look.
It's also art.
So when a character is in motion with this gigantic swooshing anime type background, you can have these lines kind of come over the character to signify that the character is moving through the environment or through the air. And you can kind of carry some of these, like, you know, blue colors they have continue onto these lines that come across her body. Not all of them, just a few, just to kind of get the sense that she is moving through space. And then when the character starts to slow down before she gets thrown off, you can see the background actually becomes chunkier and larger shapes to show that it's, you know, kind of coming to a stop. And then the character gets thrown off. You can see her backside comes up and over like this as she gets thrown off. And then in the next shot, we just have a simple arc down. So I kind of touched on this in the Puss in Boots video too, but you have the action of Vulture's wings carrying over through the edit. So right here, they are kind of at their peak of being thrown out in front of them. But as we see here, the wings actually will continue. That was a horrible arrow. Hang on. So the wings will actually continue to move up through like this, just so we get that sense of continuity through the edit. And like I mentioned earlier, when Gwen impacts the ground, it looks different from when Vulture impacts the ground. So you have this bright white shape element that kind of acts as like an impact shape. Okay, so we definitely need to talk about this shot. This was the shot that made me want to talk about this scene at all. So obviously the character is silhouetted against the pink lights behind it, but you have this wings coming through, and they're really emphasizing the foreshortening of these wings coming through, where the wings almost feel like they are, you know, probably like 10 feet out from in front of the character. It's just a really cool way to get this character in here. So for the actual landing of this character, they are actually, from what it seems like, stretching the legs beyond the edge of where they would normally be away from his head. Because you can see they have the head here and the feet here, and then they really increase the distance between the bottom of his feet and his head so that he kind of absorbs into that landing pose. And the way that you're able to track his head is they have these really bright white eyes functioning as the thing that your eye will stick onto as you're watching this pose. So one of the basic principles in animation is called overshoot. So the way that this character lands on a ledge, he's not just landing and then stopping like this, he's actually landing and then his head kind of overshoots its position and settles into his final rest pose. But you can see that the head actually moves down to here, almost where his knees are. And when the character stands up a little straighter, his head was all the way down here, but now it's moved back up from the overshoot, and now it's sitting up a little higher. So everything in this shot really does have some overshoot on it, including the wings. So let's see what I'm talking about here. So the way that they are handling the wings here is almost like a tentacle, if you want to imagine, where the motion of the wings actually starts kind of at the shoulders. So you can see the shoulders come through, and they are the first thing that moves down like this. I'm going to change that color again. So the shoulders are moving down this way first, from here to here. You can see the shoulders are the thing that's going to make the rest of the wing move. So you have to start with the movement on the shoulders. Then you get the rest of the elbow kind of coming through here, where let's say this is the elbow right here. It's going to come down the same way that these shoulders have moved down. So the shoulder moves down here, and now that's whipping the rest of it around. So what you have from this frame to this frame is the fingers are actually moving so fast because they're being whipped that it is covering up the elbow. But if we were to interpolate where that elbow would be, I'm saying elbow, it's just the pivot point for the wing is what I'm using that as a short phrase for. So the elbow would actually probably be somewhere around here, because now it's whipping through, but it's pulling the fingers along with it. And you get this really cool wraparound effect where the feathers kind of act as fingers to like flip in front of you. I imagine that this wing flutter is still on the rig itself and it's not hand-drawn, but you do have a lot of additional hand-drawn elements on top of that silhouette to give it that chaotic feeling of being out of a sketch, which obviously you can see along the edge here. So even on a pose that feels pretty symmetrical like this, they are implementing some asymmetry to make it a little more visually appealing. And I'll show you what I mean. So it feels like the weight is actually shifted over just a little bit onto his right side here. So it does feel like that his left eye is a little bit squished up than his right eye is. You can see that it's a little bit smaller. But also you can feel like the weight of his shoulders is actually just a little bit off kilter, meaning that the weight is distributed and his hips would be like here. So he does have some asymmetry to him. It's not much. It doesn't require a lot of asymmetry to make a pose feel more appealing, but it's just a simple trick that they are utilizing here and throughout this scene.
Oh, look, it's your cousin.
Okay, we got to step through this charge up shot because my goodness, this is some brilliant 2D effects work. So if you're a 2D artist and you worked on this movie, good job. Get yourself a raise. So let's look at how they do this flash frame here because I think it's really interesting. Anime flash frames are almost always unique. So there's not really one steadfast rule to use for these flash frames, but here's some techniques that you can take from this shot if you're studying it frame by frame. So obviously this effect is really bright. So just like when you film a campfire, the fire itself is going to be really bright and you're not going to be able to see anything behind it. But if you expose for the background, the element itself of fire is almost always overexposed. So they actually kind of do that with this effect here, and I'll show you what I mean. So they have this effect. Obviously this is really bright and it's peaking as bright white as anything on him. And obviously you have these tanks kind of filling up as they go, which is super unique. But right before he does shoot this blast, it gets even brighter. It goes to complete white. The first thing that you would see on here with this element being really bright is where it's going to be hitting the character along his edges. This is kind of art directed too, because you could have highlights like on his arm here or on this part, but they chose to keep it on his head just to kind of center it up. So they start with this bright white element pose, and then they move into this almost inverted frame. So what was white actually will just flash because now you're flipping back and forth between black and white. And now almost everything that did have a highlight, like his eyes and his beak, almost get reduced, like they're removing the information here as if it's, maybe a frame or two forward. So this is not a hard, steadfast approach to flash frames like this, but I think it's a really cool way to learn how to do it. And then after this flash back from this inverted frame, you're going back to this color palette of, the bright white and then the elements themselves of the like yellowish off-white energy. And you have this element kind of, as the camera pulls back, it kind of flattens into a beam because right now it's just this gigantic wedge. So if we go from here, you can see it actually become more of a wedge shape. So now the angle is getting really thin here, and as it goes even more, so it's almost like, an alligator mouth kind of clamping down to really focus that energy. And as it gets closer to her, we see this in the POV shot. And the elements get brighter as the energy approaches. Just so cool. I mean, this is just so unique. What other movie does this?
I wouldn't play with fire, so you're just kind of made of paper.
You can learn a lot just from this one shot. Oh, and look right there, Jeff Koons. How about that? So the way that they're moving Gwen through this scene and flipping her over is, again, they have her limbs being really, really straight here to emphasize that ballerina sort of inspiration for how she moves. Whereas if you look at basically any scene of Miles Morales moving, it's almost always that he's like stumbling through this world and his limbs are just like crazy contorted. I think they kind of do that more in the first movie than the second movie, but he still is kind of learning how he moves through the world. It seems like Spider-Gwen has been moving like this for a long time and knows exactly how to flip out of the way in circumstances like this. So her movements are very calculated, and even the flip from this pose into this pose, you can see her head has turned back. So she's almost looking at where she's going to be landing in the next frame already. And the animators are holding that pose in the air, so you do feel that hang time. And then they're utilizing things like smears coming off of the shoes here to really show how fast she is moving through these poses. And then, again, you have this settle pose where she lands on the ground, but it's all emphasizing these straight lines on her body. So, her arm position from here goes up into her other arm, and her leg is even pointing that way as well. So you have this really strong triangular pose of her landing and being totally in control. I said this last time, and I mean this, nothing in animation is there by accident. So even on this quick thwip here of the web shooter, they're still kind of following the same principle. Because it's completely perpendicular to camera, you do have less of a frequency on this, but you still see that this web has some slack to it. Rude. You still see that this web has some slack to it before it becomes really straight, and then she pulls herself through. I feel bad just stepping through this shot because, oh my gosh, the amount of work just on this one effect in the background here, it's so cool. I love that you can tell in this shot here what he's about to use because they put the sketches of the tool on frame before they show it. So obviously the chains on this have this really cool outline effect on here to match the rest of his silhouette. But I just think it's so cool that the chains seemingly are not complicated geometry. They're really just like simple shader drawings. We can try to see. It does feel like this is a texture and not like an actual chain element. If I was going to venture a guess with this, I would say that this is actually just a texture that is on a narrow strip of geometry, and they're just applying it to this kind of unique shape here. But there's not any sort of like real chain interaction here.
Ciao, ragazzi.
Oh
no. And now, his feet are here, but now his legs are up here. So, if I were to draw this out, where his hips are, based on where his legs are and his feet, you have the center of gravity collapsing into the wall. So another example of overlap in this shot is you have the head moving back before you have the arm come up and to reveal the weapon. This is a really simple thing, but it would feel a lot different if the character just went from here to here, just straight back, very linear. So his head goes back first and then his arm comes up to reveal the new weapon. And just like before with the example of Gwen pulling up Vulture's wing to throw him over the ledge, in order for us to really feel this impact or lack of impact, as you'll see here in a second, they have the head and the shoulder actually lead the action before dragging the arm through. So it's not just from here right down to here, it's here to here, where you have the shoulder kind of leading that pose, and then you follow through with the arm. So you kind of have this whip sort of effect that comes through. I'm doing a lot of arm action today. And then obviously you have the hand get stopped by something. What could that something be? I think this is cool. You kind of get the sense that it is from another dimension because you have that same glitch effect on the hands here. And now it started to interact with that, jagged outline of Vulture. I love Gwen's facial expression here so much. I think the fact that I can say this is a cool facial expression on Gwen while she's wearing a mask is just a really cool indication of how much these animators are working to get these poses exactly right. Because you can tell just from this pose, the way that the eyes are shaped is giving off confusion, a little bit of like, she's still pushed into a wall. So she's kind of got that like one eye closed deal, with her eye being here. But then her, she kind of has like an eyebrow here to be like, what's going on? It's just a really cool eye mask that you have in this character. And the way that the eyes don't swoop down here really shows that, she's scrunching up. So the cheeks are actually being pushed up onto the eye. I feel like I can do a whole video just talking about Miguel O'Hara. So if that's something that interests you, let me know and I can break down a different scene from this movie. But I love the way this character sort of materializes via glitch into this scene where you can feel, the start of his hand. I'm going to use a different color here. You can feel his hand starting over here with his other arm. And then as he pulls himself in, he's actually moving his arm behind him. So you do feel, that's his arm coming through here. You do feel it move up over this way. So up there and then up this way. You do feel that movement coming through. As crazy and chaotic as this glitch effect is, it still holds true. And then the way this, this whole effect goes back into his arm up there is just super cool. Yeah, the artists are pulling out all the stops here for this color flash. So then when Miguel comes through here, you have these really harsh shapes coming off of his fingers and his body that just sort of wipe through and just really get your eye to move through and catch that, because it is pretty quick. He's only on screen, his body, for 1, 2, 3, 4 frames, maybe 4 frames. So you have this streak behind him so that your eye kind of catches what just happened. And then this reaction shot of Gwen, this has got to be a painting of some kind because, wow, look at this. I mean, the way that her arm comes across, her hood is perpendicular to that, and the way that her eyes slowly start to open and kind of, as she sees what is going on here, revealing more of the top of her eye so you can see that pose. And then obviously, the streaks from the rocks here. Boy, that is a work of art right there. And then the shot of him coming through and he slowly is turning his head to look at her. Just some amazing detail work here. So I'm going to stop it here. If you want to see me react to any more scenes from this movie, please let me know in the comments. And also let me know if there's any other movies you want to see me react to. These are really fun to make. If you want to see another reaction video just like this one, I actually reacted to Puss in Boots: The Last Witch, which you can watch here. Until next time, thanks for watching.